The auditorium was buzzing with restless energy, the kind that always lingered at the height of a school talent show. Bright stage lights glared against the curtains, judges tapped their pens impatiently, and parents fumbled with their phones, ready to capture the next big performance. After a series of dancers, comedians, and singers, the audience expected yet another flashy act, something loud, bold, or rehearsed. Instead, a quiet hush fell as a thin, 16-year-old boy named Ethan stepped onto the stage. His shoes squeaked softly on the polished floor, and in his hands was not a guitar, not a microphone, but a plain wooden flute. Murmurs swept through the crowd. A flute? In a competition filled with pop songs and dance routines, the sight felt almost out of place. Some kids snickered, others leaned forward in curiosity. Ethan shifted his weight nervously, avoiding the blinding lights that pinned him in place. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the flute, but his eyes held something steady, a quiet determination, a silent promise to himself. Then, without a word, he lifted the flute to his lips. The first note was soft, almost hesitant, like a whisper afraid to be heard. But it carried across the room, cutting through the chatter, silencing laughter, and commanding attention in a way no one had expected. In that single fragile sound, Ethan transformed from an awkward teenager into a storyteller. The audience leaned closer, sensing that this boy and his flute were about to deliver something extraordinary. The silence in the auditorium deepened as Ethan continued to play, his flute releasing a melody that seemed far larger than his small frame. The notes were not just music, they were emotions given voice. The tune rose and fell like waves, sometimes tender and sorrowful, other times filled with hope and resilience. It was as if he were speaking through the flute, sharing stories he had never spoken aloud. Somewhere in the middle of his performance, a shift occurred. The crowd no longer saw a nervous teenager, they saw an artist. Ethan's eyes closed, his body swaying gently with each phrase, his fingers dancing gracefully over the instrument as though guided by something far beyond technique. His song carried echoes of struggle and triumph, memories of quiet nights when he practiced alone, the loneliness of moving from place to place, and the responsibility of helping raise his younger siblings after his father's absence. As the melody wrapped around the room, it touched everyone differently. An older woman dabbed her eyes, reminded of her late husband. A young man gripped his girlfriend's hand tighter, thinking of battles he was fighting silently. Even the judges, known for their sharp critiques, leaned forward, lost in the music. Then came an unexpected moment. Ethan opened his eyes and noticed a girl in the front row, sitting in a wheelchair, struggling to see through the crowd. With a slight nod, he shifted his melody, softening it, weaving in a theme that seemed to speak directly to her. Her face lit up, and the audience gasped. Ethan wasn't just performing, he was connecting, giving his music to others as a gift. By now, the auditorium was transformed. No one shifted in their seats, no one whispered, every soul seemed suspended in the web of Ethan's music. The melody had grown stronger, more confident, as though the flute itself had found its voice. With each note, emotion swelled, grief and joy, pain and healing, struggle and triumph, woven seamlessly together into something that felt universal. And then came the climax. Ethan drew a deep breath and released a soaring phrase so pure and haunting that the room seemed to hold its breath with him. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, vibrating in the chest, stirring something long buried in every listener. Tears streamed freely down faces, strangers squeezing hands without a word, united in a shared, unspoken recognition of their own struggles reflected in the boy's music. The girl in the wheelchair leaned forward, eyes shining, her smile radiant, as though the song had been written for her alone. Ethan saw it, and it gave him strength to push the final note further, holding it steady, pouring every ounce of his heart into the air. When the last sound faded, silence lingered for a heartbeat, thick, powerful, almost sacred. Then the auditorium erupted. Not in polite applause, but in a tidal wave of clapping, cheering, even shouting, as the entire audience leapt to their feet. Judges wiped tears from their eyes, unable to hide their awe. Ethan lowered his flute slowly, his hands trembling, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming realization of what had just happened. He had not simply performed. He had opened his soul, and in doing so, touched hundreds of lives in a single, unforgettable moment. The ovation roared, but Ethan's quiet smile said everything. The music had spoken. News of Ethan's performance didn't stay inside the auditorium walls, it exploded beyond them. By the next morning, clips of the 16-year-old boy playing his flute had gone viral. A shaky cell phone recording captured the moment when silence fell across the room, when tears streamed down faces, when the crowd rose as one to give him a standing ovation. Millions watched online, commenting not just about his talent, but about the feeling his music had given them. "It reminded me of my mom," one person wrote. "She used to play flute before she passed away. I cried for the first time in years." Another posted, "This boy made me call my dad and tell him I love him. Haven't done that in a long time." But the ripple spread further than words. Schools across the state began raising funds to support music programs, inspired by Ethan's story. Volunteers stepped up in their communities, believing once again in the power of simple acts to create change. Musicians, young and old, dusted off forgotten instruments, finding courage in the reminder that even the softest sound can carry weight. Ethan, however, remained the same humble boy. When asked about his sudden fame, he smiled shyly and said, "It wasn't me. It was the music. It belongs to everyone who listened." In living rooms, classrooms, and community centers, people weren't just replaying his song, they were carrying forward the message behind it, that vulnerability could be strength, and kindness could be louder than any stage spotlight. Months later, Ethan returned to the same stage, but this time the lights were softer, the seats filled not with judges or anxious competitors, but with children. Some had never held an instrument before, others came from schools where music programs had been cut long ago. Ethan stood at the front, not as a contestant, but as a teacher. He knelt beside a little boy whose hands fumbled nervously with a flute and smiled. "Don't worry," he whispered, "just breathe. The music will come." Around the room, laughter and small notes filled the air, sometimes squeaky, sometimes off-key, but each sound carried the joy of discovery. Ethan's eyes shone as he guided them, remembering his own shaky first steps. Among the children was the girl in the wheelchair he had once seen in the front row. Now she held a small flute of her own, her fingers pressing the keys with determination. When she played her first clear note, the entire room erupted in cheers. Ethan's heart swelled. This was the real gift of music, not applause, not fame, but the power to lift others. As sunlight streamed through the windows, Ethan realized something profound. That night months ago, he had stunned a crowd. But today, he had planted seeds of hope that would grow long after the sound of applause faded. And in that moment, he knew, sometimes the quietest voices create the loudest echoes in the world.